So today, like Ari said, today is Leonard Bernstein, and this is a special one because in a lot of ways that we'll see, Leonard Bernstein, Lenny, is the culmination of everything we've done so far in the series. And his music combines the songwriting of Irving Berlin, combines his Jewish roots, combines the music of Copland, jazz, Broadway. He's the one who not only combines it all, in some ways, he's really going to take it to its apex. He's really going to be the one who takes all of this and just produces remarkably good music. And from this point, and beginning next week, when we go to the last part of the series, we're really turning to something different because in the last three sessions, we're going to be talking about more contemporary-ish music. So next week is going to be Jews in Motown, and then folk music of the '60s, and then we're going to finish. Uh, but Bernstein, I mean, in many ways, his legacy lives on. So I have to start with a disclaimer. I really have to, and I believe in full disclosure. Full disclosure, I have not yet seen the new Leonard Bernstein movie Maestro. I am going to see it. I was going to see it this week. I'm going to be honest with you. I was going to see it. I'm deliberately waiting until after I do this because Leonard Bernstein has been someone I've just been fascinated with for a very long time. I remember studying him in school. And well, I want to present Leonard Bernstein to you not through the eyes of Maestro, because that movie is a whole separate conversation in a lot of ways. But I want to give you my understanding of Bernstein before I see Bradley Cooper's version of the movie. So no, I have not seen it. I heard it's great, and I'm definitely planning on see it. There is a relatively new biography of Leonard Bernstein that I would recommend. It's part of the Jewish Lives series at Yale University Press, and it's just called Leonard Bernstein: A Jewish Life. What this series does. We've already encountered one. There was a new one about Irving Berlin. What this series does is they find the best person to write the biography, and they also foreground the person too. So you should definitely get it. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it anywhere. It's a terrific biography. So Leonard Bernstein, well, in a lot of ways, his life and his career and his connection and his impact on music, in a lot of ways, it's going to be some of the same things we've seen so far in the lives of people that Ari mentioned before, that people we've talked about before. And it isn't just that he combined it all. He comes from these roots. He was born the child of Russian Jewish immigrants. He grew up in the Boston area. One of his earliest memories is attending congregation Mishkan Tefillah, which then was in Roxbury. That's one neighborhood in Boston, or one inner suburb of Boston. Today, it's in Newton. It's a leading congregation in the Boston area, and he does have those memories there. So what I want to do with Bernstein is, I think the best way to cover his voluminous career, I'm going to say right now, we can't talk about all of it. There's just too much good stuff. But I want to start by talking about the music he wrote, drawing on the Jewish themes of his childhood, and then including one of his first symphony, known as the Jeremiah Symphony. And we're going to focus specifically on the second movement. And then, yes, we will talk about his contributions to Broadway, and we'll see some of the things we talked last week about Broadway, how Bernstein he took it really to the next level. And we're going to focus on what I think are his two most important Broadway plays. The second one we're going to talk about is West Side Story. Don't worry, of course, we're going to talk about West Side Story and his role in it. And the first is going to be Candide, which I think for him, although I think he thought musically West Side Story was really his tour de force. But the play Candide and the musical Candide, I think that's when it meant more to him than West Side Story. So we're going to talk about both of those, and then we'll wind up talking about his third symphony, which is known as the Kaddish Symphony, which in many ways ties a lot of his career together. So growing up in the children of immigrants, his family was not very Jewish in the religious sense of the term. They went to synagogue sometimes, enough so that going to synagogue had an impact on him. They were not terribly observant. He would define himself, and we would probably categorize him either as an ethnic Jew or a cultural Jew. So he didn't do that much religious, but he was proud to be Jewish. He felt very, very Jewish. He had a Yiddish and a Shama. He had a very Jewish soul, even though he wasn't that much of a practicing Jew or an observant Jew. He felt it very much. And like I said, he was very much enamored with the music. Among other influences, he loved the music in the synagogue. In fact, one of the things when he was interviewed toward the end of his life, he died in 1990, and one of his last interviews was in 1989, and he recalled the way the synagogue music of his childhood had affected him. This is what he said, quote, he remembers being in the synagogue and, quote, I felt something stir within me as though I were becoming subconsciously aware of music as my raison d'etre. He realized his own identity as a musician from the music he heard in the synagogue. Now, it wasn't only cantorial music and choir music. There also was an organ in this congregation, which sometimes when he was a little bit older, he actually played it sometimes. So he was involved, I would say, in his synagogue, he was involved more musically than anything else. And some of his earliest pieces of music, certainly his earliest pieces of classical music, drew on that early synagogue experience. But he had other influences as well. He was very much influenced by, as I mentioned, by the songs of Irving Berlin and the Gershwins, by the music of Aaron Copland. He was one of the first 20th century composers to integrate the sounds of jazz music into the classical music tradition. Before Leonard Bernstein, in many ways, jazz music and classical music were separate. They really weren't supposed to mix, and they were supposed to be, one is jazz is more improvisational, and it's more sort of salt of the earth. Classical music is more formal and it's more scripted and it's different instruments. And Bernstein found the way not only to play them together, but to have them complement each other. So let's listen to an early example of that, where one of his earliest pieces is he took the text of Psalm 23. That's the Lord is my shepherd. He took the Hebrew text, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and he set it to music. So let's listen to this performance. Now, what I would urge you to listen to is, first of all, you have these two young singers who are singing the Hebrew text of Psalm 23, but listen also to the jazz influences here. Let's take a listen. Stop there. All right. Definitely worth hearing to the end, but time's time. But you can hear there's the jazz part of that. There's also part of that which is Copland, which he very much modeled after Copland piece like Lincoln Portrait or Rodeo. You can hear all the influences in his music. I was trying to find, I couldn't find an example of a setting of a text from Psalms that uses a jazz sort of motif, Kan Kesef Yarbitzeni, before Bernstein. And this was something very original and something very novel. And that's really what his music is. It's original all over the place. Also, the ways he used instruments. He had accompanying these singers. he just had a solo harp. Others would have used more instruments, but Bernstein had the confidence to say, we'll just have a harp. We'll keep it simple. That's something else he got from Copland's later period, simplicity as a useful part of music. Now, one of the places where Bernstein really got to master and hone his craft as a young adult, he was the music director at a summer camp in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, called Camp Onoda. I tried to Google it. It might still be there. He was in charge of writing music for plays and performances at this camp. And this was a camp that drew other young people who were interested in music. But can you imagine going to camp and I mean, you expect to hear some sort of, camp performances are what they are. Sometimes they're pretty good, sometimes they're not. But at Camp Onoda, in the late 1930s, they got to hear Leonard Bernstein music. Imagine hearing that. And that's where he really began not only to find his voice as a composer, as a songwriter, but others began to hear him as well. Eventually, he graduated from Harvard. He also got a degree in music, so he had this academic training in music. But one of the things he never lost, even when he was studying the more intricate, music from an academic perspective, he never lost touch with the fact that the most important thing about music is it's supposed to sound good. It wasn't only about making it technically elaborate or complex or technically interesting. The aesthetics of music were probably his most important interest. He wanted people to enjoy it, even more complex music. He wanted it to be accessible, even to people who were not music aficionados. So the piece we just heard, if you had never heard a choral setting of a psalm, you could still enjoy that. Like the early Copland music, you had to have developed an appreciation for it. Let's listen to another setting he did of a prayer called Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu is a prayer that's recited predominantly in the evening service, and this is really the sentiment based on the Tanakh that God should spread over His shelter of peace, and comfort us. Let's listen to a little bit of Hashkivenu. Now that one, he recalls writing that one. He really drew on his own experience being the organist in the synagogue. He was fascinated with the tonal qualities of the organ and how it complemented voices. And that's really what was behind that. But that was really him. He grew up hearing that kind of cantorial music, and this is him trying his own hand. And I think you'll agree that as that kind of music goes, whether it's your taste or not, that was some pretty good music. But I think the classical piece that he wrote, where he really took something Jewish and transformed it, not just incorporated it, but transformed it into a classical piece of music, was in his Jeremiah symphony, his first symphony, especially in the second movement. Now, the musical motif for this movement is drawn directly from the cantillation trope we use when we chant the Haftorah in the synagogue. So when you chant the Haftorah, it sounds something like this. Mapach bashdanu zekef katon mercha tibcha munachet nachta. That's basic Haftorah tune or Haftorah trop. Now let's listen to the way that Bernstein, who grew up hearing that. Now he didn't go to something like that often, but he was fascinated with the fact that the tune used to chant the Torah and the Haftorah wasn't melodic, it was more modal. It was more like a chant. So here's him taking a chant used to recite the Haftorah and turning it into a piece of classical music or incorporating it into his first symphonic piece, the Jeremiah Symphony. So let's listen to that second movement. So I would say that I'll go on a limb and say someone who hadn't grown up hearing people read Haftorahs was not coming up with that. So what you see what Bernstein did, he took the basic motif from Haftorah chant, he added in the syncopation, and smooth the edges like from jazz music, and then as composers of symphonies often do, is they take that motif and they basically pass it from instrument to instrument. So it starts out with the flute, it goes to the clarinet, it goes to the strings, more dramatic, less dramatic. Now you may also have noticed that one of the dramatic strings part of that piece, that sound, especially the tension and the chromaticism there, he's gonna use that again later, because some of the music he eventually came up with for West Side Story was music that he originally experimented with or tried out in this movement of the Kaddish Symphony. He was someone who not only learned from other composers, he also learned from his own music. He was convinced, he never took seriously all the praise that he got for how good he was. He was convinced that he could always improve and always improve his own music. And I think as far as his classical music goes, there's so many things we could listen to, but I think those three really give us a flavor, a taste of what he was going for. But And I noticed a question in the chat. This is a good point to address. I said that he is really the first to incorporate jazz music into classical music. And then the question was asked, what about Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blues? Rhapsody in Blue. Wasn't that jazz music incorporated into? It's a great question. And what it really comes down to is musicologists have been debating for a long time. No one questions that there's a jazz influence there. But the question is Rhapsody in Blue, does it belong in the pantheon of classical music? Musicologists have trouble categorizing that. It could be in certain structural ways, but it usually is somewhere within show tunes or show music or jazz music. It's one of those sort of gray areas. What Bernstein is going to do is put something which is clearly in the realm and the pantheon of classical music. Of course, what he's best known for is his Broadway music. So let's turn and talk about his contributions to Broadway. And I think in many ways, his experience at summer camp, not only putting on shows, but the whole performance aspect of it, his own love of performing. Nobody conducted a symphony the way he did. That full body, he wasn't interested. He didn't care about how he looked. He was flinging himself into the music. In fact, the conductor that he modeled himself after was one of the main ones was Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler was a Viennese-born conductor who was Jewish. He conducted in Vienna and in Budapest and in Berlin at the turn of the 20th century. He wasn't Jewish, but he was of Jewish origin, and he was often criticized for it. But he didn't care. Mahler's music was, and this is really what Bernstein gets from his music, Mahler's music was iconoclastic. Mahler, as a classical composer, challenged the basic norms of tonality and classical music. And for a long time, for the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Mahler had a limited following in Europe and a virtually non-existent following in the United States. It was Bernstein who loved to conduct Mahler's music. He's the one who really introduced Mahler's music to an American audience. One of the ways he did it was when he would conduct it, he would turn to the audience and say, you may not get this the first time. You might have to hear this twice to be able to appreciate it, but I promise you it's worth listening to multiple times. And, after 10 years of Bernstein conducting Mahler, Mahler became something very big in the United States, in the classical music scene of the United States. Bernstein he led this kind of Mahler revival. He felt a certain kinship with Mahler, or a kindred soul, someone else who was really bent on challenging norms in order to improve the music. It wasn't challenging norms to make people have to wince when they hear it. It was challenging norms to make the music sound more beautiful, to help the music reach its own potential. Now, Mahler, as iconoclast, was also very present in his Broadway music as well. Bernstein, as you might know, he was gay at a time where it was very difficult to be openly gay. But that was him, and that's something that he, as a part of his life, I think it's captured in the movie. I don't know, I haven't seen the movie, although I did see one comment in the chat that said maybe it's not that necessary to see the movie. I'm still going to see the movie, but he felt himself, his life, he felt himself to be an iconoclast. He felt himself to be someone who was going to challenge norms fearlessly. Now, it was difficult to be openly gay. And he hemmed and he wavered on how open to be about it. His close friends all knew, but this sense of challenging the status quo was very much evident, certainly in his Broadway music. It's one of the things that drew him to the play Candide. Now, as you may know, he wrote the musical Candide with Lillian Hellman. But before it was a musical, originally Candide was a play that was written by an 18th century French philosopher whose name was Francois-Marie Arouet, who's more commonly known as Voltaire. Voltaire was a thinker of the French Enlightenment. Moreover, he was probably most instrumental in publicizing the radically new ideas of the French Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment was an 18th century cultural movement which introduced Europeans to these radical ideas like the primacy of reason over faith, just because there's some faith tradition which tells you to do something or not to do something, if you can reason out a different solution, that's okay. The universal brotherhood of man was a radical idea. The perfectibility of man was you don't have to be Christian to achieve some kind of perfection in your life. These are all very radical ideas, and Voltaire was the disseminator of them. Now, what also drew Bernstein to Voltaire was not only these ideas, but Voltaire's life. One episode in particular that Bernstein was very much taken with. Voltaire grew up in France, and he was a scholar of the Enlightenment in France at a time when France, in 18th century France, the French aristocracy was basically untouchable. Not only were they the upper class of society and all powerful, you weren't allowed to insult them in any way. And one of the things that frustrated Voltaire is he would be speaking to a French aristocrat who was basically an ignoramus and just an idiot, but you're forced to listen to this person blabber on about nothing because they're rich and powerful and they have the status. And Voltaire couldn't really live with that. So Voltaire was at a party once, and he insulted basically he made fun of a French aristocrat without the French aristocrat knowing that he was making fun of him. You know what I'm talking about. And the aristocrat found out about it eventually, and Voltaire was forced to flee the country and live in England for 20 years. But it didn't stop him writing about just how awful the French aristocracy was. And Candide is very much about this notion of just accepting authority without questioning. So Candide is a story about a young man named Candide, who the play opens where he's being taught by his mentor Pangloss. And Pangloss, the wizened old philosopher teacher, is modeled after an actual European philosopher whose name was Leibniz. Leibniz was the ultimate rationalist, and the ultimate rationalist meant as long as something sounded logical, it didn't actually have to make sense. Rationalists like Leibniz would just weave these elaborate proofs to things. So, for example, one of the things that Voltaire is going to parody in Candide, and that Bernstein is going to turn into a song in the musical Candide, is one of the things that Leibniz used to actually say was this. This is an example of, his ridiculous rationalism. Not that rationalism is ridiculous, just when it's not sensible. So Leibniz would say, because this is the only world we know of, this is by definition, it's the best world because it's the only world. There's no world better because there is no other. And since this is the only world, since this is the best world, everything that happens in this world happens for the best because this is the best of all possible worlds because it's the only world. Now, if you're like me, you hear that and go, okay, I suppose that's logical, but it's also kind of stupid. But in Leibniz's day, Leibniz had a patron who was an aristocrat. You weren't allowed to challenge it. Now in the play, Candide is this young student who basically tries to challenge him. If this is the best of all possible worlds and everything that happens here happens for the best, what about war and death and misery? Keep in mind also that Voltaire wrote this play in the 1750s. And what really turned Voltaire into an intense social critic, especially critical of the church and religion, is in 1755, there was an earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, which basically leveled the city, killed tens of thousands of innocent people. And the church's only real response to it was, well, obviously they were sinful and they were being punished by God. And Voltaire just thought that was the most horribly cold and insensitive and not compassionate thing to say. And that's where he realized how ridiculous it was. Leibniz was among those that said, look, this is the best of all possible worlds. There must have been a good reason for that earthquake to happen and kill all those people. And that was really what gave Voltaire the incentive to write Candide. Now, Bernstein, where he really felt this sense of kinship with Voltaire, is he also was a social critic. He was a social activist in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement. He spent much of his life campaigning, lobbying, fighting for the rights of people who were less fortunate. And really he saw Voltaire as a kind of role model here. So let's listen to a little bit of the best of all possible worlds, and you can hear how Bernstein is going to turn the Candide's or Voltaire's critique of Pangloss, who was Leibniz, through the mouth of Candide, the title character. Let's play the best of all possible worlds.
Let us review lesson 11, paragraph 2, axiom 7. Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Pray classify pigeons and camels.
Pigeons can fly.
Camels are mammals.
But there is a reason for everything under the sun.
There is a season for everything under the sun.
Objection! What about snakes?
Snakes. 'Twas snake that tempted Mother Eve. Because of snake we now believe that though depraved we can be saved from hellfire and damnation.
Because of snake's temptation.
If snake had not seduced our lot and primed us for salvation, Jehovah could not pardon all the sins that we call cardinal, involving bed and bottle.
Now on to Aristotle.
Mankind is one, all men are brothers.
As you have done, do unto others.
It's understood in this best of all possible worlds.
All's for the good in this best of all possible worlds.
Objection! What about war? War. Though war may seem a bloody curse, it is a blessing in reverse when cannons roar, both rich and poor by danger are united.
Till every wrong is righted.
Philosophers make evident the point that I have cited. His war makes equal, as it were, the noble and the commoner. Thus war improves relations.
Now on to conjugations.
Ammo, a mass.
You can stop there, Larry.
Amamus.
A mass.
See, in Voltaire, in Leibniz's world, or in Pangloss's world, and the world that Voltaire couldn't stand, and the thing about the life about the 20th century that Bernstein didn't like, is people just dogmatically accepting things true because there were people who said they were true. Bernstein said you have to think, and in many ways, his music, the way it challenged existing musical norms, was a reflection of his larger approach to the world. Don't settle for things the way they are. Try to make them better. Change them when they need to be changed. Now, there's another song in Candide where one of the characters sings about the importance of yielding one's own identity in order to basically follow the crowd. This is a song called "I Am Easily Assimilated." And this is a character who's basically saying, you know, I had this upbringing, but I'm giving it up for something better because that's what everyone thinks is better. And I'm not preserving who I am. Let's listen to a little bit of "I Am Easily Assimilated" from Candide. This is
I was not born in sunny Hispania. My father came from Rovno, Gubernia. But now I'm here, I'm dancing a tango. Di-di-di-di, I am easily assimilated. I am so easily assimilated. I never learned a human language. My father spoke a high middle Polish. In 1/2 hour I'm talking in Spanish. Por favor, Dariador, I am easily assimilated. I am so easily assimilated. It's easy, it's ever so easy. I'm Spanish, I'm suddenly Spanish. And you must be Spanish too, to like the natives do. These days you have to be in the majority.
Sorry, I met Patty Lupone, not Ida Lupone. Yeah. Anyway, so what this song is about here, Bernstein is not only speaking generally, he's speaking more specifically to assimilated people and assimilated Jews. Because remember, this character basically says, I was born in this gubernia somewhere in Lithuania or in Poland. Clearly this character has some kind of Jewish background, but now they've become Spanish because Spanish is just more impressive. Bernstein is speaking to those fellow Jews in America who are maybe trying to hide the fact that they're Jewish. He never did. The most he did was his parents changed his name from Louis that he was born with to Leonard, which is basically the same thing. Maybe Louis sounded a little more Jewish. I don't know, but that's what that song is about. But where he's really beginning to challenge that kind of dogmatic thinking is the song from Candide called auto de fe. Now, an auto de fe was an old Spanish and Portuguese term for burning someone at the stake. So for Voltaire, this is the quintessential example of religious intolerance. You believe someone is so sinful that you take the right to burn them to death. And remember, when the Inquisition would do this to people, the auto de fe was something that the Spanish or the Portuguese Inquisition would do to heretics. You do it, but they actually thought they were doing the person a favor by preventing them from dying in sin and then burning in hell for all eternity. Better to experience a little bit of pain in this life and be redeemed and not sinful and be able to go to purgatory or heaven instead of having to go to inferno and be eternally damned. So the song, that's in the play Candide, the excitement that people had for the auto de fe, not just because it was something exciting going on at a time when there was nothing exciting going on, but also the exuberance, this sense of what a happy thing it is we're doing. Look at the way we're helping this person. So let's listen to how Bernstein turned that religious intolerance into a song about the auto de fe.
What's a day for an auto da fe? What's a sunny summer sky? What's a day for an auto da fe? It's a lovely day for drinking and for watching people fly. Hurry, 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 watch it fly. Hurry, 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 hurry. See the great Russian bird. Why a comb for your hair?
But the price is much too high.
Here be potions and pills for your fevers and chills.
But we haven't any money, so there's nothing we can buy.
Any kind of metal, any kind of metal, any kind of metal, bought and sold.
Any kind of metal, any kind of metal, any kind of metal, turn to gold.
Pots and pans, metal cans, bought or traded or sold.
I can turn them into gold.
Pans and pots and whatnot, trading new ones for old.
For a tiny fee, my alchemy can turn them into gold.
Hurry, 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 come and burn. Hurry, 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 come and burn. What's a fair, what's a fair, it's a buy everywhere. What the prices on the line, it's a fair, it's a fair, it's a buy everywhere. But we haven't any money, so there's nothing we can buy.
But you can't execute me. I'm too sick to die.
So what I love about that song is, if you had heard the tune without knowing what it was about, I'm pretty sure you weren't going to guess that was about burning someone at the stake. It sounds like people racing around for some kind of exciting party or some sort of celebration. It sounds like anything but burning someone at the stake. But what Bernstein and what Voltaire are parodying is the excitement, the exuberance with which people would follow the orders of the Inquisition and just carry out this kind of religious intolerance. That's what Bernstein was using his music, and very much used. Pretty much the play Candide was about the importance of being a free thinker, the importance of challenging existing ideas, the importance of being a critical thinker, always asking the question, how do you know that? Why should I believe you? Bernstein, remember, he's growing up in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. In every one of these decades, there was something going on in the world in which people's ability to think freely is being just crushed. So he writes Candide in the late 1950s at the tail end of McCarthyism in America, where for years he's been watching people just these McCarthy anti-communist witch hunts are just going on again and again, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. And Bernstein felt that was just absolutely wrong. And part what he's doing is trying to use his music to change that situation. Okay, so now let's get to West Side Story. because this for Bernstein was really one of his a real magnum opus for him. It was a high point in his career. He loved being part of it. Let me give you first one little piece of background that you may or may know about West Side Story. Originally, West Side Story wasn't supposed to be West Side Story. Originally, it was supposed to be called East Side Story. Originally, the story was going to be set in the 1920s, and it was going to be the story. It was still going to be the story about two gangs having a turf war, but it was going to be an Irish gang. The Jets were going to be the same, but the other gang was going to be a Jewish gang from the Lower East Side. Those were going to be the two gangs. One gang being a gang of immigrant Jews fighting for this new turf, and then fighting the native-born gang. Now, that they didn't do that for two reasons. First of all, like we said with Fiddler on the Roof last week, Bernstein and his collaborators on this play, they wanted this play to have a more universal appeal. They didn't want it to only appeal to, let's say Jews. They wanted everyone to be able to appreciate it. And secondly, along the same lines, the problem of writing East Side Story like that in the 1950s or early 1960s is by the 1950s or the 1960s, Jews in America, and certainly Jews in New York, were at least a full generation removed from being immigrants. Writing about Jews in New York in the 1950s, it was no longer an immigrant story. So at that point, if you make it about an East Side Jewish immigrant gang, it's making it something more historical and therefore less accessible and less universally appealing. But it had to be a gang of immigrants against a gang of native born. And the immigrants in the 1950s, one of the most prominent new immigrant communities in New York City, in Manhattan, were Puerto Rican immigrants. And that's why it was no longer East Side Story. It became West Side Story. It was situated somewhere on the West Side, maybe just north of Hell's Kitchen, south of where Lincoln Center now is. But it's about these two gangs having a turf war. Now, because it's about these two fighting gangs, it's also based on the story of Romeo and Juliet, where you have these two feuding families who are basically at odds with one another and can't agree, and they basically have been told to keep apart from each other. And that's the background to the story of Tony and Maria, these two young people from rival gangs who fall in love. So in some ways, that's not a very new story. That part of the story is actually a classic Romeo and Juliet story. There are many examples of that. But what I think where West Side Story really excels, where it really, really excels, is in the way that it kind of does make this an immigrant story. But there's one thing I have to tell you. There's one thing you have to notice, because here we also have an example. In writing the music for West Side Story, we have an example of Bernstein using a distinctly Jewish sound. And here I think he borrowed a page from the playbook of George Gershwin. Remember, Rhapsody in Blue begins with a klezmer clarinet, which is something very distinctly Jewish. Now, Bernstein's not going to use a klezmer clarinet here, but he's going to use something else very Jewish. The prologue, the beginning, the very beginning of West Side Story, the opening scene, both in the play and the movie, the musical motif is drawn from a sound that was specific to the synagogue, that Jews would hear specifically in the synagogue. So let's listen to a little bit of the prologue and see if you can guess what it is, or if you can spot what it is. Harry. Yeah. Before we get to that really familiar one, like some of you noticed right away, this is the sound of the shofar. Da da da. The tekiah sound of the shofar, which that's what opens it up. Now he didn't do it just pick some random sound from the synagogue. The tekiah sound is its original use in the Torah when the priests in the temple or in the desert would blow that sound. That was a call to arms. That was a call for the people to rally. And that's how that scene is beginning. It's a call to arms for the two gangs to stand up with one another. But that's the sound he's using. And you notice as it goes on, eventually, it isn't just the short one. Eventually, it goes to the long blast, the Tekiah Gedolah, da-da, at the end. That's how he opens it up. That's how he introduces it. But and that leads into the larger themes of the play and the story and the Romeo and Juliet. But it isn't just Romeo and Juliet, because the theme of the immigrant is very much part of it. And remember, Bernstein grew up in the household of immigrants. The Jewish immigrant story was very familiar to him. And even though this is decades later and he's a full generation removed, that's the story he wants to tell. And he really, but he can't tell it using a Jewish motif because it's not a Jewish immigration story. So he uses it using a Puerto Rican motif, that style. And that's the song, I Want to Be in America. So in that song, you have two groups. It's a very upbeat song. And you have the boys and the girls among the sharks and their girlfriends. They're singing, one is saying why America is good, and one is saying why America is not. Here we can do this, but you can't do this. That's the immigrant story. That's the immigrant dilemma. Do you focus on the possibilities, or do you focus on the limitations and the obstacles? In this story, or at least in that song, the boys are focusing on the obstacles and the girls are focusing on the possibilities. So let's listen to a little bit of it. And I believe we're going to watch a clip from the movie, and I believe that's Rita Moreno playing Maria.
Once an immigrant.
Hey, look, instead of a shampoo, she's been brainwashed.
Stop it!
She's given up Puerto Rico, and now she's queer for Uncle Sam.
Oh, no. That's not true.
Puerto Rico, my heart's devotion. Let it sink back in the ocean. Always the hurricanes blowing. Always the population growing. And the money owing. And the sunlight streaming. And the natives steaming. I like the island Manhattan.
I know you do.
Smoke on your pipe and put that in.
I like to be in America. Okay, by me in America. Everything free in America.
For a small fee in America.
Buying on credit is so nice.
One look at us and they charge twice.
I have my own washing machine.
What will you have, though, to keep clean?
Skyscrapers bloom in America. Cadillac zoom in America. Industry boom in America.
Wealth in a room in America.
Lots of new housing with more space.
I know. Hard to cut that one off. First of all, yes, obviously Rita Moreno was playing Anita, not Maria. I misspoke there. But that's really about that. That is a dialogue or a conversation that would happen in every immigrant community, including for Jewish immigrants. Is it easy here? Is it not? Is it worth staying? Did we make the right decision? Was back home better? And that's something that is part of this play. Now, as you know, just like the story of Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story, it's tragic. There's killing at the end, and here is Bernstein's ultimate optimism, because the song that really is going to carry the play, and it's really going to be the last music you hear, isn't a killing song. It's Somewhere. He writes a utopian, futuristic, optimistic song that even though there are difficulties and even though we deal with things like gang wars, someday, somewhere, there is a perfect place where we're all going to live together. And that's really how the play is going to wind up. And the play actually winds up, after Tony is killed, the play actually winds up with them walking off hand in hand with the two groups actually reconciling. It's a very optimistic message by Leonard Bernstein, which he wrote at a very difficult time. There's one last piece of music I want to look at, and this is his third symphony, the Kaddish Symphony. Now, the Kaddish Symphony, in addition to being, just musically spectacular, he actually also includes narration. The same way that Copland did in the Lincoln Portrait, he's going to include narration, but his narration is going to be much more aggressive. The narrative voices in the Kaddish Symphony are basically, it's centering around the Kaddish, which is, of course, the memorial prayer in Judaism, but the Kaddish is also the prayer that connects one generation or this generation to the previous generation. It's deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, and in some ways, Bernstein's going to invert that a little bit, because he's going to use the context of the Kaddish for a younger generation to challenge the ideas. This is what you've taught me. How can you say? So how can you say that? It doesn't make sense to me. He wrote this in 1963, and originally it was dedicated broadly to people struggling for justice, but he wound up finishing it, but its first performance actually took place just a few weeks after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. So he wound up dedicating the premiere performance to President John F. Kennedy and the world he was trying to create with Camelot and the Great Society and things like that. So let's listen to a little bit at the beginning, and then and part of the second section as well. Let's listen to this invocation section where you have this, the music is backing up this angry voice.
Oh, my Father, ancient, hallowed, lonely, disappointed Father, betrayed and rejected ruler of the universe, angry, wrinkled old majesty. I want to pray. I want to say Kaddish. My own Kaddish. There may be no one to say it after me. I have so little time, as you well know. Is my end a minute away? An hour? Is there even time to consider the question? It could be here while we are singing, that we may be stopped once for all, cut off in the act of praising you. But while I have breath, however brief, I will sing this final Kaddish for you, for me, and for all these I love here in the sacred house.
You can stop there, Ari. See, in some ways, Bernstein is taking the meaning of the Kaddish prayer, which is a prayer of praise to God. I know he associated with mourning, but that's the moment when traditionally Jews would recite this praising God prayer as an affirmation of the connection between Jews and God. And what Bernstein is doing here is says, no, the Kaddish is that's not what should be. That's not the prayer that should be said. That's a moment when one has the right to really challenge the justice of the world, the justice of the universe, the justice of God. That's what's really supposed to happen. And that was really what animated Bernstein. Now, I did have another clip. I don't think we're going to have time for it, but let me conclude with Bernstein and just say a word about his legacy, because I saw a question in the chat about it, his relationship with Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim was his younger protege. He and Sondheim basically wrote the music for West Side Story together, and Sondheim he fancied himself a disciple of Leonard Bernstein. And what he tried to do is simply to carry this musical tradition forward. Sondheim would be the first to admit that his music, while his music is great, was never as original as Leonard Bernstein's music. He always felt he was sort of Bernstein 2.0, even though he was able to carry some of these themes further. But Bernstein, Bernstein really becomes this kind of template as to what a Broadway show could be, in terms of music, in terms of theme, in terms of the basic sources you base it on. But it's also, he also becomes a template for how one incorporates the music of one's own roots into one's classical music or into Broadway music. But Bernstein also really epitomizes about how an artist, a musician, a composer isn't just writing music. You can actually use this music to change the world, to make the world better. And that's a notion that Bernstein never gave up on all the way into the rest of his life. You can't just write music just for music's sake. Music has to mean something, and music has to make the world better.
Thank you. Again, we're going to have another program about Leonard Bernstein coming up next month with Dr. Joshua Jacobson from Boston. So we'll see what his take is on the music and the story. Here are some questions that have come in. Please feel free to share your questions in the last few minutes. Was Bernstein noted to be a musical prodigy at a young age, or did it come out later? Because I did start to watch the movie Maestro, and it just starts at a certain point where he gets subbed in to lead the orchestra. So
right,
it doesn't really go backwards.
As a child, his parents almost didn't give him music lessons. They didn't really see the point. He didn't seem that special. In retrospect, he probably was, but there's a point where he's a young adult where he is called to sub in as the maestro of a major symphony. This becomes his moment of discovery. But his musical genius probably is before that. I mean, already when he's writing music at the summer camp, and already when he begins to set the Chichester Psalms, his genius is always pretty apparent. So it depends. If you ask the people who were around him, they didn't recognize it till a little bit later. But in terms of what he was doing, his genius was pretty present pretty early on. It's just a question of other people noticing it.
Thank you. One thing you didn't mention was, did he write any music or any themes about Israel? Did that Zionism, Israel, did that come up in his?
Yes, in the 1960s, he traveled to Israel. He was a devoted supporter of Israel. He was, he didn't like to pigeonhole himself as simply being a Zionist. He always said, I'm a lover of the state of Israel. He believed in it. He was a Zionist. He was a big supporter. And he wrote just a couple of things about Israel. What he would really love to do is to bring his music and perform it in Israel. One of the things that Bernstein was noticed for here, he was noted that he was the first American-born composer of a major American symphony. And in Israel, he's really was one of the first major composers and major conductors who would bring one of these major symphonies to perform in Israel. So he conducted the Israeli Philharmonic, but he was also instrumental in other music coming to Israel as well. And he definitely felt that kinship. Part of his his ethnic, being an ethnic Jew or a cultural Jew, Israel was certainly a part of it.
You played pieces from Kaddish, and we heard the Haftorah. Obviously, for Jewish people, these would resonate. Seems unusual to me that these would be popular in the non-Jewish world. So I'm wondering if there was.
It's a great question. They were popular for different reasons. For Jews who came and heard Jeremiah and heard the Haftorah, they never heard the Haftorah performed. No offense to anyone who reads the Haftorah, just the music being so beautiful. For non-Jews who weren't familiar with it, it was just the aesthetics and the quality of the music. If I had played that Jeremiah movement and hadn't told you, and you had never heard a Haftorah before, it still sounded pretty good. The music could stand on itself. And one of the reasons he was so popular was that the music was able to engage, whether you knew where it was coming from or not. I mean, that's really the sign of universally popular music. Plus, when people went to see him conduct the music as a conductor, there was no one else like him. They had never, your typical conductor would be more reserved and more, with a certain decorum. And Bernstein was performing He was almost Hasidic in the way he would conduct, almost singing and dancing, flailing his arms. That was something very novel. There are other conductors that do that now. So people love to watch him perform, but just the sheer aesthetics of the music, the quality of the music would appeal to everybody.
I should have asked in our audience today if anybody had seen Bernstein in person conducting. So if you have, please chat in the last few seconds. Can you give us a promo for next week's class in the series?
Yeah, next week we're gonna pivot a little bit. We're gonna talk about the role of Jews in the rise and development of Motown music. So what we're going to talk about, in part, we're going to talk about some Jewish musicians, but really we're going to talk about Jewish music producers and how Jewish music producers were instrumental in creating the whole world of Motown, in discovering and helping African American musicians who otherwise might not have gotten an opportunity. I'll just give you one little promo. Is if you ever watched the show The Sopranos, Tony Soprano's Jewish friend Heshy was based on a guy, one of the leading Jewish promoters of Motown music. And that's one of the people we're going to talk about next week.
Terrific. Well, wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom and enjoy the sun out here in Southern California. I think it's coming back. We'll see you on Sunday. Shirel Horowitz is actually giving us a class about art in Israel post October 7th. Should be fascinating. And we're back with Howard on Tuesday, Gila Fine on Wednesday, and Howard on Thursday. So a lot more coming up for CSP. I'm glad that, we have people who saw Leonard Bernstein conduct at Tanglewood. A few people have put it in the chat. So that's pretty amazing. I knew you were an amazing audience. Okay, guys, take care. Be safe. And go watch some Leonard Bernstein clips on YouTube, or watch West Side Story. Watch the new one by Steven Spielberg, or the movie Maestro if you haven't had a chance. Take care. Bye, everybody.